Alright, in this video I want to briefly go over the dialogue by Plato, which is called the Meno. It's a very, very famous dialogue, famous for very many reasons, and this is also very famous because it has a lot to do with Plato's philosophy of mathematics. And Plato is very interesting because you don't see really that many, if any, philosophers today who have a philosophy, which is a theory or a philosophy of everything. Plato literally has his theory of the forms, and that gives you in just that, and in his philosophy of the forms, you have a metaphysics, of course, you have a epistemology as to how you can cognize of the forms, or can experience of the forms. So we have epistemology and a metaphysics. You have definitely a ethics, because they talk about justice and virtue and such. You have a political philosophy, of course, the republic, as well as the statesmen and the laws, which give you kind of the way that Plato thinks a government should be run, or a republic should be run. And there's also a aesthetics or a philosophy of art there too, and there's probably more than that. There's literally a theory of everything. So this dialogue is of course just like any other dialogue. Socrates is talking with somebody, and usually the dialogue is named after the person that Socrates is talking to, and of course this is Meno. He's having a big debate about having a big dialogue with Meno. And they talk about these sophists, and they talk about very many things, but the whole thing starts with virtue. And what is the nature of virtue, and how can virtue be taught? In the Republic, the whole thing starts with a discussion of what justice is, and that kind of snowballs into a theory of the forms, a political philosophy, an ethics, and a metaphysics, and a epistemology. And it just, like, when you're talking about a ethical or a political term, the whole dialogue snowballs into something huge. And that's what this does here, because he asks, can one teach virtue? Can you teach virtue? And they are thinking of virtue as the fulfillment of what you're supposed to be doing, or what your role is. Plato in the Republic talked about how justice has to do with everybody doing his role in society. How some people had the role of being a guardian, some people did have the role of being a poet, or a leisurely person, or there are various different classes, which I talk about when I do have 10 videos, one for each book of the Republic, and that's a lot of detail there. So they ask, can one teach the fulfillment of a role, of what you're doing, of what you're supposed to be doing in your life? And they talk about the relation of virtue to justice, and ask what the virtue of a cat or a dog, or if a cobbler is. A cobbler is, of course, the virtue of a cobbler is, of course, to make and repair shoes. And the virtue of a dog is to do dog-like things, and the virtue of a cat is to do cat-like things. And he does kind of talk about Socrates, or Meno kind of accuses Socrates of being a stingray, or the word which they kind of accuse of him a lot is being a sycophant, or somebody who stings you and numbs you and puts you in a state of aporia, or a state of uncertainty, where you thought you knew about things beforehand. You thought you knew how the world works, and you had all of your concepts and notions figured out. but then Socrates comes along and kind of tears the whole thing down for you, because he asks you what all that stuff is and what it all means and how it all works, and you end up not really having answers for all of Socrates' questions, and that's why he's a stingray. Dr. Sadler, Gregory Sadler, excuse me, has a lot of good videos on Plato. He has a series which is called his philosophy core concepts, where he does go into depth on a lot of the things in various dialogues of Plato, and he has a ton of stuff on various other philosophers as well, like Aristotle, and even thinkers in the existentialist movement. So they talk about that, and then they're basically asking the question of what is virtue, and that's how the whole dialogue gets rolling. And Meno says that each being has its own virtue. That means its own its own thing it should be do, its own thing that it should be doing. And the whole thing is that Socrates is not looking for what virtues are. He's like, Meno is going to keep giving him answers of what virtues are. How the virtue of a cat is this, the virtue of a cobbler is this, the virtue of a silversmith is this, the virtue of a dog is this, blah, 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 blah. Meno keeps kind of giving him what virtues are, when Socrates wants a blanket concept. Socrates wants Meno to give him his answer of what virtue is, the entirety of what virtue is, a blanket concept going over all of those things. And it's kind of interesting because the form is, when you ask what the form of beauty is, you don't start naming off beautiful things. The form of the beauty is the form of beauty is found in those beautiful things. But the form of beauty is not just what those beautiful things consist in. The form of beauty is something beyond that, and that's kind of where the abstract, concrete distinction of metaphysics kind of comes in. Abstract being that it's the form of beauty or the form of good cannot be found in one object. The form of beauty blankets over many things. Okay, and you cannot really define all of those things or figure out what all those things are. While a concrete object is, say, a pen or a marker or paper, where if we see a piece of art that's beautiful, that piece of art is a concrete object, and the form of beauty is in a way instantiated or finds itself in that piece of art. However, you cannot define the form of beauty by that one piece of art or by any piece of art, because the form of beauty is something more than that. So he wants a blanket concept. Socrates, he talks about virtuous characteristics like justice and moderation, and he's just Meno keeps on failing him. He keeps on failing him and not giving Socrates a blanket concept until Meno says that virtue is to be able to rule over people. And Socrates says, how is it virtuous to rule over people as if you're ruling over slaves? There's nothing virtuous about that. And Socrates says, well, what if it's just the justice or the just rule over people, and justice as a virtue. Justice, he says, is one of the virtues, but it doesn't define virtue as a blanket concept. Meno doesn't really understand the distinction between a virtue like moderation or courage versus the blanket concept of the virtue. And Meno keeps on naming virtues, and it's kind of he's kind of committing the fallacy of composition because he's thinking that the naming off all of the virtues makes virtue, because the fallacy of composition or compositionality is that the parts that makes up a whole thing doesn't necessarily confer properties to what the whole thing is. Then Meno says that virtue is wanting beautiful things and the ability to get those things, and wanting good things for oneself and the ability to get good things for oneself. But then Socrates says, this is virtuous only if it's done justly and piously. But Meno, this is when Meno calls Socrates a torpedo fish or a stingray. And he numbs whatever he touches, because Meno thought he knew what virtue was, and now he totally doesn't. So then he asks the question, what is it to define something? You give a form, the form of beauty or the form of virtue, the blanket concept, which blankets over its many concrete individuals. And it's kind of virtue is the paradox of virtue as to how to seek it's the paradox of any kind of blanket concept, really. It's that how can you find out what virtue is or what justice is when you don't know what the whole blanket concept is? Because Meno makes the failure of just keeps on giving you virtues or just things, and not justice as a blanket concept or virtue as a blanket concept. It's that paradox, because how can you define virtue if you don't know what it is beyond its if you don't know what it is beyond its constituents or its parts. And so we don't know how to really define virtue at this point, and then this is when we come towards the theory of learning by recollection. It's the issue, can we teach virtue? And if we don't know what it is, how can we teach it? So this is when we come towards the whole thing of learning by recollection. And I have a video I made a long time ago about this, but this relates to philosophy of mathematics, because the form of number applies to this, because philosophy of mathematics asks the question, what is number, and how can we cognize it, how can we understand it, and how is it that I can know that 3 plus 2 equals 5 and not have to think about it, and is number or mathematical entities something that I make with my mind, or that my mind make? Thus, is it a idea, or is it a manifestation of linguistic structures, or is it something abstract and objective that is out there that I have to cognize, or in this case, recollect? And thus, given this case, we think about it, and we learn by recollection, because the forms are there for us to recollect with it, and we knew them since birth. So our souls, Plato does have a bit of a dualist thing going on, because our souls do have the ability. Our souls, our bodies don't immediately have all this stuff in our mind. We don't have all the cognizing of the form. We don't have all the knowledge of the forms in our bodies. However, our souls do, and when our bodies try to think of these things, we can recollect some of this information. However, our soul by itself knows all this stuff. That's kind of a bad way of explaining it, though. So we learn truth by recalling it, and the soul is a immortal thing which does know all this stuff, and our body, which is mortal, has to think of it and recall it from our soul, because our soul obviously is immortal and knows all this stuff, and our bodies have to, us basically in this world, our bodies have to recall it. And Meno, he wants evidence that we learn things by recollection. And then this is when this is the famous thing of Socrates. Socrates calls over a slave boy and draws a thing in the sand which looks something like this, where he asks him questions as to, is this, you can see how these move, this square, which is bigger square, is this square the double of this one, and is this square, the whole entire square, the double of this one? And he asks him questions about that. And he asks about the lengths of the sides, and what is the double of it, the double of its area. The slave says some things, and Socrates kind of calls him to be wrong in some cases, but the slave is in a state of aporia, or uncertainty. And Socrates asks the slave again. He kind of draws a different thing, which is like a square with a diagonal line through it. He asks the slave, does the diagonal line cut the square in half? And the slave says yes. Socrates doesn't teach the slave all these things, but only asks him questions. And the slave comes up with right answers, and the diagonal line is what the slave seeks, and it seems to show that the square is doubled, as you know, as if I had drawn a diagonal line through this, that as the diagonal line went up, the square would double. So the point here is that Socrates is kind of drawing lines in the sand and asking a slave questions, and the slave comes to the right answer, and Socrates says, Socrates says that he didn't teach the slave this, and he was asking the slave questions, and the slave came up with the right answer. Socrates then states that this knowledge, this mathematical geometrical knowledge came from the slave's soul, and that's how knowledge by recollection works. Some do interpret this as Socrates actually did teach the slave boy this in this dialogue, but that's like, I guess, an issue for people who are like trying to interpret Plato, because there are many different interpretations of Plato, and as to whether it's correct, and as to whether who's right, and as to what Plato is really trying to say. So that's, a big thing in the philosophy of mathematics, because the form of number, it can be recollected because of the immortality of the soul. So then we how do you define or find what you don't know? You seek it, and you recollect it. You look for that which you don't know, and it will come. Then both Meno and Socrates argue that virtue is whether virtue is taught, or whether it's learned by being taught, or whether it's learned by recollection. And it's, of course, another thing that is learned by recollection, according to Socrates. You take hypotheses or possibilities, and you try to answer the problem, and thus it'll be correct by what your soul immortally knows. Um, and then you approach the truth without knowing it, and then it comes because of this little setup of the soul. So we have again here a philosophy of mind, which is tied with the metaphysics, epistemology, on ethics, and even a political philosophy. And virtue, according to Socrates, is a kind of knowledge, so it can't be taught. Virtue is basically already known. If something is good, that is not the form of knowledge. It is possible that that virtue isn't. How does virtue relate to wisdom? Is it a part of wisdom or knowledge? Wisdom and knowledge are kind of somewhat equated. Virtue, according to him, is not wisdom because virtue is taught. And thus it is asked to Meno, because Meno thinks still that virtue is something that is taught. Socrates asks, where are the teachers? And then if there are none, then virtue isn't taught. And then Anytus, who is he's a pretty political and important person here, talks about these standard ways of teaching. Experts in each field or each place are paid to teach. And who are the experts of virtue, though? Who are the experts of virtue who teach? And then it's thought that the sophists are. The sophists are people like Protagoras and Gorgias, who don't teach you philosophy as much as they teach rhetoric. And rhetoric is the ability to persuade you to think one way or another. And that's kind of the way law has become, because lawyers, it seems to me anyway, that lawyers no longer are concerned with the truth, but they're concerned with persuading the jury or the judge to think a certain way. And they have to be good in rhetoric because they have to know how to persuade someone to think a certain way. And Anytus hates the sophists, and they and that they corrupt the youth, and they do all these bad things. Socrates says, who can teach virtue and who cannot? Anytus says that a true Athenian gentleman can, or the man to the son. The man teaches his son the virtue, and the son turns out less than perfect as a result of this. If virtue is teachable, a person could teach his son virtue, but that doesn't happen, because a true Athenian gentleman teaching his son virtue, the son turns out worse than his son. So the whole man to son thing doesn't really work out. The man teaches the virtue, but the whole thing never really works out, and the son turns out not so good. And if virtue could be taught, then the whole man and son thing would make the son virtuously perfect, or virtuous at least. Therefore, virtue is not a teachable thing. Meno says that Gorgias of the sophists only claimed to teach rhetoric, and Socrates says that this is confusion over something that is not teachable, and everyone is confused of whether virtue is teachable or not, and Socrates is committed to the fact that it is not. So virtue is a kind of wisdom or knowledge. Virtuous is if the act of being virtuous is not from knowledge, and virtue is not teachable. But Meno says that why is knowledge worth more than right opinion, or thinking rightly? Socrates says a man possesses valuable he kind of gives the whole thing about a man having this sculpture of Daedalus, and if the thing is tied down, it's worth more. However, if it's not tied down, it's worth less. If it can be moved around, it could be exposed to elements more, and it won't last. Therefore, it's worth less. Right opinion is, or having an opinion that happens to be right is like the sculpture that is not tied down. Knowledge is the tied down sculpture, and the knowledge is the these the reasons why a certain opinion is true. Thus, recollection. Back to that whole thing. And virtue, according to Socrates, is not inborn and not teachable. So how does one become virtuous? Socrates leaves it a mystery as to how one becomes virtuous, and he kind of leaves that to like a soothsayer or somebody who talks to the gods and can talk to you, or somebody who has some kind of divine power between himself and the gods. And virtue is a godly gift without really trying to understand it. So no one can really understand virtue unless we have another aporia or a state of uncertainty as to how that whole thing works. So through this, you got an idea of how the form of virtue works, the whole blanket concept thing works, and you got the theory of recollection. Unless you got a philosophy of mathematics from this. There's also a part in the Republic. Anything about the forms is good to understand Plato's philosophy of mathematics, but the whole thing, you kind of never really figure out in this whole dialogue what virtue is, other than being immortal knowledge of the soul, and thus the body recollects it, and you never find out what it means to be a virtuous person. So, however, that's why I like these kind of dialogues, because you start with one thing and you end up with total other ones. You end up with different things, and it's not always the case that a question is really answered. But Socrates is not of the business of answering questions. He's of the business of asking them.